Hello, I'm Lydia and this is the wonderful Miss Amanda Bowden.
Hello.
Hello. Now, Amanda, do you want to tell us what we're going to do in our tutorial today?
I am Lydia. I'm going to tell you. Here we go. So we are going to take this rather lovely sleeved shirt and we're going to convert it into a sleeveless shirt using the minimum amount of materials and upcycling as much as we can from this garment for the purposes of beauty and thriftiness.
What's not to love about
What's
that?
not to love about? So taking the sleeve out is automatically going to make it sleeveless, but you're going to be left with quite a broad shoulder line, which isn't that flattering. So what we're actually thinking of doing is marking a new design line on the garment so that you can get something that's really going to be flattering, and there are a few different ways that you can approach that.
Okay. Number one
is, we happen to have this on a form, but you could put it on yourself, get somebody to take a photograph, or with a selfie stick take a photograph, and then you can experiment with your editing tool by putting different design lines on.
Yeah.
The second way of doing it is grabbing a shirt that you've already got that's sleeveless and you like where it sits on you, measuring that through here, copying it so that you're sure that it's going to sit right on your shoulder line and that you like how it looks. Failing all of that, you can also just take out 2 centimetres here just to bring that line up and blend it through to the rest of the existing armhole. Okay, so you're really talking about having a curved line so that the underarm is still quite static and stable. So really you're talking about removing it from here to give a different, more flattering line on the top of your arm. The other thing you can do is you can grab a piece of wool or a piece of string. I've got a piece of cotton stay tape which you might have in your haberdashery, or a piece of ribbon, something that allows you to lay it on and start experimenting with where you want that armhole to begin. Okay, so we're sort of really taking it up in quite an extreme way here. I think for Lydia, something that's probably more flattering is bringing it around here, and this tape is super because it will bend and is quite malleable, so really you need to look in front of it and also check the plan view so you've got something that's travelling over the top in a sympathetic fashion. And I can actually pin the stay tape into position because we've got to add some seam allowance to this. This is the finished line, not the cutting line, okay? But equally so, if you're not using stay tape, you can actually just pin beside it and use a pin mark, or you can grab a non-permanent fabric marking pen. This is air vanishing, so it does go quite fleetingly, but you can also use a pen and you can see that you'll have a line to follow as well. So we've removed one of the sleeves. In order to get an exact symmetrical copy on the other side, we're going to use the existing sleeve as a template, okay? But what we need to do is turn it inside out first, okay? And then we're going to feed this sleeve onto this sleeve, okay? In the style of putting on a sock. Okay. And then we are going to match up our shoulder seam to our shoulder seam. Okay, and we're going to put a pin in right there, okay, because we know that that's got to match. And then we're just going to feed this round and we're going to match our underarm seam. Now, actually, if you happen to have a spare human,
always handy,
then get them to put the shirt on. It's much easier to feed it onto a form. Or if you've got a mannequin, it's perfectly possible to do it like this, you can see, but getting those safety points in first is really jolly important so that you end up with an exact copy. And all I'm going to do is pin the sleeve we've cut off onto the existing one, and then you should see, ta-da, that we have got a line. So I grab my vanishing pen, I put my line on, so we're using this as a pattern for the other side, okay? And then I would take it off, I would cut it, and then both of my sleeves have been taken off in exactly the same way, proportionately the same. So you can see that we've got a raw edge here, so that needs to be finished in some way because it's going to be fraying, it's unattractive, and it's going to weaken the garment. So there are two things. You could actually just fold it over and do a little hem if you wanted to, but there are lots of different changes of grain line direction, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So the other thing you can do is that you can use a bias binding and bind the edge by sewing this on and turning it over and stitching it. Even better is that we can utilise some of the spare fabric from the sleeve to create our own snazzy bias binding. Thrifty and gorgeous, love that.
Wonderful.
Coupling. And that's what we're going to do. So that's what we're going to talk about now. Okay, so we've got this really, really nice feature of a cuff with a placket here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut that off. Don't throw anything away because you never know how you might wish to use that later on. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut up what would have been the underarm seam, okay, because I want to maximise the amount of fabric I've got from which I'm going to make the bias, okay. So I flattened out the sleeve. We've got this nice straight line which shows the centre of the sleeve, and it also gives us a grain line to follow, because when this garment would have been cut out, the sleeve pattern would have been laid so that it was parallel to the selvage, which gives us a nice straight grain line. We're talking about bias, and sometimes bias is we've all heard of the word, but maybe we're not sure what it is exactly. So on a piece of fabric, you'll have two selvage edges. You'll have the warp threads which travel along the selvage. We'll have the weft threads that go from side to side. And then the bias is simply a direction. So on my ruler, I can see that my 45-degree angle is showing a line of bias. And that's actually where the fabric is at its stretchiest. So there's more space in between the fibres and the construction of the weave to allow the fabric to stretch and return, which is why bias binding is made by cutting strips of fabric at that angle, because it allows us to stretch those strips of fabric around a curve and get a really nice tidy finish. So I'm going to show you how you mark that up. I'm going to use my temporary pen and I'm just going to draw a line down here. You'll also notice that I've got two different types of rulers. Some of you might have an imperial ruler like this, some of you might have a metric ruler, okay? So I'm able to switch between the two because of my age and being a child of the 60s. I know, it's unbelievable. And then if I put my 45-degree line on my straighter grain, I want to position that so I can get the maximum length, okay? And I'm going to draw my line on here, okay? And then what we're going to do is cut 1.5 inch or 4 centimetre strips. So I'm going to use my lovely pattern cutting ruler here. Okay.
So is this possible with an ordinary ruler? It's just easier with this tool.
Yeah, so let me just actually grab that, Lydia. Hold on, you got a little headshot there. So if you've just got an ordinary ruler, you can just mark up 4 centimetres in little spots and then do a bit of dot to dotting. Like that, you see.
And it's not only creative, but it's also fun, isn't it?
Well, dot to dot, colours, rulers, we'll do some cutting.
So many things.
So many things. It's just wonderful, isn't it? Okay.
Great.
So I'm going to carry on doing that in a minute and cut as many strips as I can because I need to have enough to go right round my armhole. So we need to edge finish the armhole, and in order to do that we need to have a long enough piece of bias strip to work with, and because we're utilising the strips from the existing sleeve, it's not giving us enough length, so we need to actually join them together. So the first thing you need to do is you need to square off the edges of the strips that you've already prepared, okay? So I'm just going to cut up, okay? And then I lay one on top of the other to make, look, a backwards L for Lydia.
Perfect, or an A for Amanda.
Yes, if I had a little strut going over there. And I'm going to pop a pin in there. We're doing right sides together.
Some right angles there. So there's one you prepared earlier.
Here's
a bit
one
like Blue Peter.
Absolutely. And you'll also notice that using my vanishing pen, I've lined across. This is going to give me a sewing line, okay, for when I join. Okay, so I'm going to stitch those together now. Bring my machine over.
Ta-da!
Here we go. Using a nice bright thread so you can see exactly what we're doing.
Yeah, you would probably use a matching thread to do this.
You would for the proper job.
But it would actually be hard for you to see, so we've done it in neon yellow instead.
Okay, so needle in on the line. Just going to get rid of that pin, okay, and bring it forward a bit. There's no need to backstitch on this, okay. Whoops. Okay, and get rid of that. There we go. Till I get to the end, needle up, press the foot up, pull the fabric out. Just going to snip and snip. Very vibrant. I'm going to also trim that triangle off to reduce the bulk on that side of the bias, and then, oh, how pleasing.
Ah, ta-da!
Okay.
Perfect.
So what you can do is that you can end up joining all your strips together, so you get a nice long piece to use.
To work with. Perfect. Now this is my favourite bit because this is where it all comes together, all the bits that you've done, and suddenly you go, oh, this is amazing.
I know, it's exciting, isn't it?
It is exciting.
So I've put it onto the stand because it's actually much easier to show you how to do it. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn one of my edges over by a scant 1 centimetre.
Yep.
Okay, and I'm going to put the cut edge of the bias to the cut edge of the shirt.
Okay.
And I'm going to put the fold to the existing seam line. Okay. So I'm just going to pin that in. All right. Like so. Okay.
Yep. So then, the raw edge is the raw edge of the bias binding is against the raw edge of the shirt.
Yes, absolutely. And both of those edges are together, and that's why pressing it really helps. And this is super stretchy. Can you see that there's quite a lot of give in it? So it's going to travel around that curve really nicely. So what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to, about every 2 fingers, I'm going to put another pin in.
Lovely. So you've pinned it all the way around.
Yeah.
And now got back to
And now I've got back to the beginning. Okay, you can see that this is longer than I need it to be. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to put a pin in where those 2 edges are going to butt together. Okay. Then I'm going to fold it back. Okay. And then I'm going to grab my scissors and I'm just going to cut. Oh, that's well, that's lovely. My goodness me, that's just, thank you. Thank you. That's very good. Okay, and then I can just use that pin. And this means that it's going to meet. So you don't have to worry about measuring everything. You let the fabric do the work for you.
Brilliant. Okay,
and then you trim to what you require. I'm starting at the underarm seam, but not on the seam. Okay, sometimes sewing machines struggle a little bit if you're putting them too much under bulk at the start. So just come away from it. I'm using the edge of the presser foot to match up the edge of the bias binding and the armhole fabric.
So that's the way you're going to guide it all the way
That's the way I'm
around.
going to guide it. So
we would suggest using a matching thread.
Yeah.
We're using bright pink,
Yeah.
partly so you can see it, and also because we think it'll look cool.
yes,
So that's just a reason, but we'd do it in matching thread normally.
absolutely. So I'm just going to go forward a couple of stitches, back a couple of stitches, and then I've got my handy carrot. Okay. And we are just going to travel around slowly but surely.
And your pins are in perpendicular to the fabric. They're not going along the fabric.
Yes, because it allows the fabric to move a little bit. And also if you put your pins in so that they are parallel to the edge, sometimes what can happen is that you end up picking the fabric up and making a bunches, yeah. So perpendicular. It also makes it easy just to take them out and then throw them into your lap because you missed your pin cushion.
Brilliant.
Okay, right. And then I'm just going around and taking my pins out as I go.
Okay, Amanda, pressing. This part is quite important, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of pressing, as you know.
Yes,
pressing.
Essential.
We're not ironing.
No, not
ironing.
Pressing. We're pressing. And you're using a tailor's ham there.
Yes, I've got a tailor's ham, which has got a double layer of cotton on this side and then wool for more vulnerable fabrics or for steaming. Okay, not everybody has a tailor's ham. What is jolly useful is I've just taken a hand towel and rolled it up, because then you can press on the towel as well.
It's ideal to have something that isn't flat, because we're pressing something that is curved, and therefore it's helpful to have something curved on which to press.
Because we don't want to bash all the elasticity and lovely shaping out of the garment and what we're working on. So that's why I use a ham or a rolled up towel, or if you've got a sleeve board as well, you can use that. So what I'm doing is I've laid it on. I'm right-handed, so I've got the body of the garment on my right side, and then I'm just going to push that bias over, and I'm going to use the tip of my iron to
press. That's not on steam.
No, it's just on a temperature which is appropriate for the pressing of the fabric of the garment. Okay, so this is cotton, so I've got it on quite a high setting. If you were working in silk or another fabric, it's always a good idea just to check on a piece of scrap, although it's quite likely it's been laundered.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm just working my way round, pressing the seam allowances and the bias away from the body of the shirt, okay? Because if I just give you a little preview, okay, what happens now is that this gets pressed in, okay, and you can see where we had that original design line, okay, and look how that is just very satisfying, isn't it? It is very satisfying, isn't it? And what we're going to do is that we're going to pin that and then stitch round.
Yeah.
So I'm going to press this now, and then I'll show you the next bit. So what I'm doing here is that I've pressed the seam allowance and the bias away from the body of the shirt, and what I'm doing now is that I'm folding it back in
to the inside.
To the inside, okay, which tidies up all the seam allowances.
Yep.
Gives it a really nice finish.
Means we won't have anything kind of messy once it's sewn.
We don't want to have messy armholes, Lydia.
No.
That would not be appropriate, I
You
feel.
wouldn't. No, but also you'll never guess that we've done the alteration and look like we bought it like that.
People will be saying, "My, where did you get that fabulous sleeveless shirt?" And you'll say, "Well, crikey."
Yes. And we'll say, "Well, actually, I made it myself.
I lady engineered it to
my own requirements."
To my own requirements.
So I'm just going to just zoom in where you are here. So all of the bias binding is on the inside of the armhole.
Yeah.
So you've then got your edge there and you're pinning all under.
Yes.
So that you've got an absolutely clean edge to the armhole. And then we're going to be sewing over the top in order to sew that bias binding into place forever and ever.
And also, because the bias is nice and stretchy, can you see how it's curving?
Yeah, so that's doing all the work for you.
So if you had just used a strip of fabric which was cut on the straight of grain, it would be pulling around the armhole and you'd be getting sort of stressed lines, like it would look like sort of puckers and pulls, which is why we use the bias. We're using the bias to its advantage because it can go around the curves. Okay, and then back to the beginning, and that's where you've got your little butting up. Now, can you see how this is just poking out a wee bit? That's not desirable. Okay, so just got a pin, poke it in, make it behave, and then put another pin on the outside so that it's tucked in, and it's going to be really tidy. Okay, so I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and stitch it now.
Yeah, so I'm using the edge of the presser foot as my seam allowance guide. I'm also starting to sew underneath the arm because we're going to have to backstitch at the start and at the end of the sewing, and we don't really want to see that little overlay of stitches anywhere more prominent, so we're keeping it at the underarm, but we're just starting a little bit away from that bulky point.
And that's it finished. Look at that. Look how neat that looks. We've got the pink line here. And if we just turn in the binding, look how neat that is underneath. I mean, that looks like we've gone and purchased that, doesn't it?
I would say so.
So we're going to just do exactly the same to the other side, which is still the raw edge, and then it's ready to wear. Haven't we done well?
We have done the royal we.
When I say we, I mean Amanda.
No, we have done it together.
But we were also saying, weren't we, that we think there are other things we could do to this shirt.
Yeah.
So it's not very fitted, and we thought what we could do is add some little darts to make that fitted.
Yeah, I think particularly on the back, because it's sort of hanging from that yoke, and so it just seems to be crying out
for a little nip and tuck.
A little playing about there.
And also the collar, I thought about this, was whether, instead of having that pointed collar, whether it's actually quite easy to make that into a collarless nary collar instead. So maybe some potential for some future tutorials, Mrs. Bowden.
I don't think we're finished with this.
I don't think we
number.
have. No, we haven't.
Absolutely. Excellent.